A transatlantic alliance confronts an old foe. NATO's chief says dialogue and deterrence are necessary to combat an increasingly assertive Russia. Is the new U.S. administration willing to play a leading role? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the war of wills between NATO and Russia. Now, last week, NATO foreign ministers gathered in Brussels for the first time in over a year. The in-person summit featured Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying Moscow's pattern of repressive behavior at home and aggressive behavior abroad required immediate collective action. From Crimea to cyberattacks, diplomatic pressure seems to have achieved little in restraining Moscow. So now NATO's 30 member states are building their biggest collective defense in a generation. And with a new U.S. president who's clearly no friend of Vladimir Putin, NATO is banking on a new administration in Washington to help get that done. Natalie Pahonen has more.
There are 30 countries in NATO, and this is how its newest member, North Macedonia, chose to mark 1 year of being in the club. These displays of taking on the enemy, holding the line, and marching in unison are certainly for show. But they also underscore the bond shared among members. Because an attack against one ally is an attack against all, and every member has to be ready to defend the alliance. And right now, NATO says the biggest threat comes from Russia.
Russia continues its wide-ranging military build-up, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, in the Middle East and North Africa, and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. Allies have called out Russia's disinformation and propaganda in its efforts to influence elections, cyberattacks, and its use of chemical weapons against political opponents, both at home and on our territory.
Some NATO members are on better speaking terms with Moscow, but the alliance's position with Russia is firmly in the grey zone. They aren't in open conflict, but it's far from friendly.
I think we all expect our relationship with Russia to remain a challenge into the foreseeable future, but it's one that we're prepared for. And ultimately, I think what we can hope is to have a relationship with Russia that is at least predictable and stable.
Reaching the point of stable ties isn't likely to happen anytime soon. The language from NATO's foreign ministers meeting was explicit. Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. The Russian news agency TASS reported a member of the State Duma Foreign Affairs Committee responding with NATO statements on threat and aggression from Russia are yet another mantra to justify the alliance's existence. The relationship between Russia and NATO crumpled after Moscow's annexation of Crimea in 2014. It's widely condemned by the international community as an occupation. This is Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier in March, celebrating the 7th anniversary of what Moscow calls Crimea's reunification.
Сказать, что мы готовы жить в новых геополитических условиях. Более того, мы рассматриваем наших соседей не просто как соседей, близких по географии. Мы рассматриваем народы этих стран как братский народ, готовы подставить им плечо и локоть для того, чтобы обеспечить развитие.
Russia hasn't shied away from playing a major role in its neighborhood or beyond. In recent years, Putin and the Russian government have been publicly named as aggressors by NATO members for everything from election interference to spreading disinformation about the coronavirus. And the UK government says Russia remains the most acute threat the country faces. After 4 years of the Trump administration's fractious relationship with NATO, the new US administration says it wants to revitalise the alliance, and it's put the Russian government on notice.
Putin seeks to weaken the European project and our NATO alliance. He wants to undermine the transatlantic unity and our resolve. because it's so much easier for the Kremlin to bully and threaten individual states than it is to negotiate with a strong and closely united transatlantic community.
But just how much of an effect will this renewed US involvement have on how NATO approaches Moscow? And will a show of unity reduce the threat felt by members? Natalie Pahanen, The Newsmakers.
Let's get a closer look now at the relationship between Russia and NATO. And from Moscow, I'm joined by Andrei Fedorov. He is a former Russian deputy foreign minister and a current member of President Putin's advisory team. In Washington, we have William Courtney, a former U.S. ambassador and White House advisor on Russian and Eastern European affairs. And from London, former British diplomat Ian Bond. He's currently the director of foreign policy at the Center for European Reform. Thanks all three so much for being with us. Andrei, let me begin with you because your take is quite unique in the context of this discussion. You say, quote, Western leaders are not afraid of Russia. They are afraid of Russian unpredictability. They cannot understand the logic of Russian actions, and this is the problem. A lot to unpack there, but first explain by what you mean by unpredictability.
I mean that the problem is that decision-making on many questions is non-public. It's based mainly on the balance within the Russian political system, within the Russian political elite, where the military and security forces has now a quite growing influence on many things. And the problem is that we are considering the current situation in our relations with the West as a crisis situation with a possible break-up with the European Union, with the European Parliament, with everything which belongs to the European structure, as well as we are expecting new tension in relations with NATO.
Okay, when I first heard your explanation there, I have to say that it almost sounded as if you were describing some kind of misunderstanding, that there was sort of failure in cultural communication between NATO and Russia. Did I misunderstand you there?
Partly, yes, because there is no communication at this moment, and there is no understanding of each other's moves. And what is more dangerous, that both sides are afraid of each other's further steps. Russia is afraid that NATO will increase its military capability, of appearance of new US missiles on European territory. NATO is afraid of a new tension on Donbass area and possible military clash between Russia and Ukraine in the coming weeks, and some other things. So this mistrust is growing, and this is a bitter reality of today.
Okay. William Courtney, let me ask you, I mean, does that make sense, what Andrei has explained from the Russian perspective?
The issue is not unpredictability. The issue is that Russia has been willing to use coercion in order to secure a sphere of influence around its borders. For example, in 2007, Russia launched a massive cyber attack on Estonia. 2008, launched a war against Georgia, particularly to take control of the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And then, biggest of all, was aggression in 2014, the seizure and annexation of Crimea, and launching a war in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which still continues, in which over 15,000 people have been killed. It's the willingness to use force against neighbors that has become the #1 issue in relations between Russia and the West.
Okay. Ian Bond, do you agree there? Is it the aggressive nature of Russia that's actually causing the problems and using force, for example, against its own neighbors?
Well, I think both of those are actually right. I mean, it is the unpredictability in the sense that, you know, we failed to predict these things happening because they weren't things that our governments would have done in similar circumstances. And I've no doubt that on the Russian side, there would also be some actions that we've taken that Russia failed to predict. But I thought, you know, that Andrei Fedorov described pretty well the opacity of Russian decision making, and that's a real problem for Western policymakers. We're trying to look into a black box, and it's really very difficult for us to understand the motivations and the trigger points that lead to the kinds of actions that William Courtney was describing.
Andrei, respond to that. I mean, does Russia bear some responsibility for being so opaque in a manner that actually creates greater tension and an atmosphere of danger when if they were more transparent, maybe we wouldn't be where we are today?
Oh, I don't think that there will be more transparency because there are difficult political interests. One of the main Russian interests is not only to secure its borders, but to have effective control over the neighboring states, especially former Soviet republics. And the tendency which is existing in Russian political life, especially during the last decade, is to think about a kind of restoration of mini-Soviet Union, a kind of new union, which be by its nature, which it will be an anti-Western union. So Russia is going on this lane and being even militarily stronger than before. Russia is not afraid of doing many things. And what is problem for today is that sometimes these political goals are backed by military actions, especially in case of Donbass, for example, and it's a big challenge also for the West. West don't understand whether Russia will stop in Donbass or will go further in Ukraine, what Russia will do in Belarus this year, etc.
Okay, I think you're describing exactly the problem, though, is that Russia is, as NATO has accused it of being, quite assertive, to put it mildly, in its foreign policy. Russia would like to reassert its kind of control over former Soviet states and reestablish its entire sphere of influence as it had during the Soviet era. That's what NATO is saying is absolutely wrong, because there are many countries, not least Ukraine, that want to break entirely free of that former Soviet influence.
I think that the main thing is only one. Russia is afraid of being alone. And this system of control, system of influence on the neighboring states is one of the most important elements of our Russian foreign policy, because Russia doesn't want to be face-to-face with the West alone.
Okay, William Courtney, does that seem at all a surprising kind of admission to you?
Well, in some respects, it's really quite an honest statement. Russia is alone now, but it is alone in great part because of the coercion that it has used against its neighbors. In the Yeltsin era, NATO reached out to Russia. NATO and Russia concluded a founding act in the late 1990s when Yeltsin was president. But since then, Russian policy has become more assertive and more willing to use coercion, whether it's against neighbors, also sending military aircraft into Syria to prop up the Assad regime, which had been using brutal force against the Syrian people. Cyber attacks have become a big issue in the United States. There's been a large Russian cyber attack called Solar Winds. In 2016, Russian election interference, both use of social media, as well as an effort to interfere with election counting systems. In 2020, the Russians did not try to interfere with election counting systems, but they continued to use social media efforts to influence the election. So there are a range of issues, and of course most dramatically recently was the issue of poisoning of Alexei Navalny in Siberia. He was fortunately flown to Germany where he recovered, but this had quite an impact in Europe. And Angela Merkel went to visit Navalny in the hospital. President Putin told President Macron on the telephone that Navalny may have poisoned himself. That caused a reaction in Europe. So there are a number of issues in which Russian behavior has caused a lot of concern in the West and unfortunately has led to Western sanctions.
Right. I want to pick up on this then with Ian because, you know, much is being made of what the West says were Kremlin-ordered poisonings. I mean, Alexei Navalny obviously being the latest case. But there are questions really as to who really does call the shots in Russia. I mean, even Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's a staunch Putin critic, has intimated that he can't say for sure if Putin or powerful organized crime elements are responsible for actions that the West clearly blames squarely on President Putin. Ian, is there a risk that the West has perhaps failed to understand what is really at play in Moscow and might end up kind of punishing those who have less control than they thought?
I'm skeptical about that, and I'm skeptical about the idea that you know, the system works outside of the control of President Putin. Now, you know, does that mean that I think that, you know, he literally gives the order, say, to go and strike the Skripals in Salisbury? No, not necessarily. But in comments that he had made about the fate that ought to await traitors to Russia, you know, that is kind of giving a green light to the bureaucracy that if you do this, you will be pleasing the president. And, you know, that's a very dangerous and irresponsible message to give. And I think we see some of the consequences of that. So, you know, in the UK, in distant history, we had a king who said of one of his opponents, "Will nobody rid me of this troublesome priest?" And a group of his knights went off and killed the priest who was giving him trouble. You know, I think we face a similar situation perhaps in Russia, that you don't have to have an explicit order that says go and poison Navalny, but, you know, it's well enough known that Putin is not going to shed any tears if that's what happens.
Okay, Andrei Fedorov, is that fair, even if Putin isn't directly responsible for ordering these? Go ahead.
I cannot say so. I think the following, that in the West, there is an opinion that Putin is controlling everything in this country, which is not true. We are describing the current situation as the battle between different Kremlin towers. And this is a reality because in many cases, some forces, including security forces, military forces, are acting on their own. And of course, they're trying not to be in a contradiction with the general line described by Putin. But in many cases, which I know personally, Putin just, okay, he's just supervising the thing, but he's not ordering to do the things.
Understood. I mean, William Courtney, this also in a sense, makes it even more complicated and complex to know that it is not just one man in control of the Kremlin and what Russia really does, which is how it is often portrayed in the West, that there are a lot of other elements. Andrei was just calling them different towers in the Kremlin. Do you recognize that there is a lot more complexity and that it could be more sinister in a sense than just one man that calls the shots?
So Russian history, before the Soviet period and during the Soviet period and since then, has generally been quite hierarchical decision-making process. So, for example, in the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in the United Kingdom, and in the case of Navalny, Novichok was used as the agent. Novichok is an exotic chemical weapon closely controlled in Russia. It is banned by the International Chemical Weapons Convention. If the Kremlin had wanted to hide its role in attacking Skripal or Navalny, it could have used a common element like arsenic. But by using Novichok, it was sending a signal especially to Russians, that this is something that is controlled right from the top. And you Russians need to bear this in mind.
Okay. I'd like to move this a little further forward then, because we really do need to look at, in the context of NATO and Russia, what the new administration in the United States might bring. Ian, you believe there are some hawks, if I'm not mistaken, in the Biden administration that could actually more, I guess, antagonize Russia going forward. I mean, how do you envision this antagonistic, potentially, relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and how that's going to feed into NATO?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that, and actually it's probably unfair to ask the British member of the panel to describe American politics. William is probably better placed than I am to do that.
Fair enough. That for the NATO relationship.
Hopefully you'll give him the floor in a moment. But what I was going to say was that the Trump administration was a very curious animal from a European perspective, because on the one hand, you had a lot of people who were very hawkish about Russia, including Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and people in the National Security Council and so on. And yet at the top, you had Trump himself, who always deferred to Putin, who, faced with a choice between what American intelligence was finding about Russian interference in the 2016 election campaign and what Putin told him, preferred to believe Putin and so on. And so for Europeans, it was a very confusing period in which you could never be quite sure what American policy towards Russia was, depending on who your interlocutor was. Now, I think with the Biden administration, what we will have is a much more consistent line flowing down from Biden himself and his national security advisor and his Secretary of State, in which they will take a very firm line with Russia, not excluding arms control negotiations and the like. But the main thing from a European point of view is that we will be dealing with a more consistent set of messages from Washington. And I think that's going to be, I mean, it'll pose some challenges, say, for Germany over the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia, which Biden has made clear he'd like to see stopped. But on the whole, for Europe, it's a lot easier to deal with a predictable, consistent set of messages coming out of Washington than it is with this sort of all over the shop, do we listen to Pompeo, do we listen to Trump?
Okay. Andrei, I have to ask you, I mean, easier for Europe now, but as far as Russia is concerned, you believe the Biden presidency will make the relationship far more difficult, correct?
Frankly speaking, I know many people in Biden's administration, and I would like to say that today in Kremlin there are absolutely no illusions about what will happen next. First of all, we see the efforts of United States to return to the front page of NATO agenda, and US will guide NATO, definitely. Second thing, which is not easy for us, is that we might see quite soon NATO is much more consolidated than before on anti-Russian platform, and this is a reality. And third thing is that we are expecting that there might be a package of breaking up a relationship with the West, as I said, with the European Union, with the Council of Europe, with NATO, etc. And in this situation, of course, tension between Russia and NATO will simply increase. And what is more, this kind of consolidation inside NATO is making more difficult our traditional policy to deal not with these structures like EU or NATO, but to deal more on the level of states. It's much more. It will be much more problematic for us.
Okay, William, Courtney. It wasn't really long ago under the early Bush administration, and of course most of the Clinton administration, when people were talking about the relevance of NATO, and people like John Bolton and even Condoleezza Rice were accused of being kind of Cold War throwbacks with outdated views. It seems those days are completely gone, and we're back to this antagonism. Do you find it dangerous going forward, or is there a way now for the new administration in the U.S. to address it and bring back a less tense relationship, to put it mildly, between NATO and Russia?
Well, you're correct in talking about sort of some of the hawkish views earlier. But once Russia intervened militarily in Ukraine in 2014, hawks and centrists pretty much became the same people. So, for example, U.S. policy toward Russia has had a lot of consistency from Obama administration through Trump and now into the Biden administration, in great part because Congress is driving a great deal of that policy. Congress always sets great store by human rights, for example. President Trump was not really interested in pursuing human rights issues with Russia. President Biden is. President Biden is really in sync with what is a bipartisan consensus in Congress. So I don't think it's fair to say that the Biden administration is going to pursue a policy toward Russia that is going to shift in a harder direction, in great part because the bipartisan policy we've had for several decades is continuing. What we are seeing is that U.S. President, more than Obama and more than Trump, is putting human rights first.
Okay, William, Courtney, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this panel. I'd like to thank all three of my guests so much for being with us. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in as well. See you next time.